Ever catch yourself daydreaming about, adding a few more years to the clock, feeling fantastic while you're at it, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
But it feels like everywhere you turn, there's another piece of advice screaming for your attention.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Eat this, not that, do this crazy workout, sleep standing on your head. I mean, where do you even begin?
Right. It can be so overwhelming.
Absolutely.
But, one idea that just keeps popping up, especially when we're talking about living longer and healthier, is this whole calorie restriction thing. Like, just eat less and boom, you've unlocked the secret to longevity.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those ideas that has really captured the public imagination, hasn't it?
So today, we're diving headfirst into the science behind it all. We've got a whole stack of research, mostly focusing on what studies with primates and other animals are telling us.
How exciting.
We're talking Rhesus monkeys, those fascinating little mouse lemurs. It's like a whole scientific zoo we're about to explore.
That sounds like fun.
So, our mission today, as we sift through these findings, is to get to the heart of what the current science is actually showing us. What are the takeaways you, our listener, should really be paying attention to? And what might just be hype, something to take with a grain of salt?
That's a great goal.
Let's jump right in with, the big guys, the Rhesus monkeys. Turns out there have been these two really important studies, almost like a tale of two labs kind of thing. One at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the other at National Institute on Aging, or NIA for short.
Right, right. Those are two of the most well-known studies in this whole field, for sure. And it is interesting, like you said, they got kind of different results, didn't they?
Exactly. So the Wisconsin study, the one at UW, seemed to show that cutting calories by about 30% really made a difference. The monkeys lived longer and seemed to avoid some of those nasty age-related diseases.
Yeah, they've had a pretty significant delay in the onset of things like cancer, heart disease, even things like brain atrophy and muscle wasting, which are pretty common as you get older.
Sounds pretty good so far, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to push those things off for as long as possible?
For sure.
But then you've got the NIA study, and they didn't see the same dramatic increase in lifespan. They noticed some trends, sure, but the difference between the calorie-restricted monkeys and the control group wasn't, statistically significant.
Right.
So what's going on here? Two studies, similar in a lot of ways, but different outcomes. What are the key differences that might explain this? Because this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so when you dig into the details, a couple of crucial things pop out. First, how they fed the control groups in each study. In the UW study, the monkeys in the control group had ad libitum access to food. That means they could eat as much as they wanted, whenever they wanted, which, probably led to some of them getting a bit hefty.
Overindulging a little like we all do sometimes.
Exactly. But in the NIA study, they gave their control group monkeys a set amount of food, portioned out. So they didn't have the chance to overeat and gain too much weight.
So if the UW monkeys were starting out heavier, then cutting their calories, even if it was the same unhealthy stuff, would naturally make them healthier.
Right, exactly. It's like if you were eating, a dozen donuts every day and then cut back to 6, of course you'd see some health improvements.
Okay, so it's not just how much they ate, but what they were eating too. And that seems to have made a big difference.
You got it. And, that kind of highlights a really important point that often gets overlooked. The benefit they saw in the UW study might have been more about those monkeys going from overweight to a healthier weight, not necessarily the calorie restriction itself. The NIA study, they started with a healthier control group, so the effects of just cutting calories might not have been as obvious.
Right. And then there's the actual food itself. The diets in these two studies, they were quite different, weren't they?
Oh yeah, big time. The diet in the UW study, the one where they saw the most dramatic effects, was, let's just say, not exactly a picture of health.
Like, what were they eating?
It was described as an ultra-processed concoction. Lots of milk protein, corn oil, cornstarch. And you ready for this? A whopping 29% of their calories came from table sugar.
29% sugar? That sounds a little intense, even for a lab experiment.
Yeah, it's not exactly what you'd call a balanced diet. Now compare that to the NIA diet. Still a lab chow, but it had more unprocessed plant foods, things like corn, soybeans, wheat. So at least they were getting some phytonutrients, those good things from plants. And their sugar content, much lower, only about 4%.
Okay, so just to connect the dots here, it seems like the quality of the diet played a huge role. The UW monkeys were on this, let's call it a less than ideal diet, so cutting back, even if it was still that same stuff, showed some big improvements. Whereas the NIA monkeys were already on a healthier diet, so just cutting back the calories didn't have as much of an impact.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And it kind of goes back to that idea we talked about earlier. If you're eating a really bad diet, eating less of it, well, that's probably a good thing.
Right, you're basically just reducing the harm.
Exactly. One of the researchers actually said, the worse your diet is, the more important it is to eat less of it.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, what about when researchers looked at all the rhesus monkey data together, like from all the studies? What did that tell us?
Yeah, good question. So they pulled together the data from 3 major studies, including an earlier one that was more observational, not as controlled.
Okay.
And what they found was that fewer monkeys in the calorie-restricted groups died from age-related causes. But they didn't see a big difference in their overall average lifespan.
So maybe they were dying from fewer age-related diseases, but they weren't necessarily living to be like super old monkeys.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like they were healthier for longer, but it didn't mean they were breaking any longevity records.
Okay, so the rhesus monkey story is a bit complicated. It's not as simple as eat less, live longer.
Right. There's more to it than that.
So let's move on to a different kind of primate, the mouse lemurs. Much smaller, but their study had some pretty dramatic findings, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely more dramatic. In that study, they cut the lemur's calories by 30%, and they ended up living a whopping 50% longer. And that wasn't just their average lifespan, it was their maximum lifespan, too.
50%. Wow, that's a huge difference. Why such a big effect compared to the monkeys?
Well, mouse lemurs are a lot smaller than rhesus monkeys. They have a faster metabolism, too, which might mean they respond to dietary changes more dramatically. But there's a really interesting twist here. Even with the calorie restriction, those lemurs were still heavier than wild mouse lemurs.
So even though they were eating less, they were still a bit chunky.
Kind of, yeah. And that makes you wonder if the benefit was more about them avoiding obesity, not just cutting calories in general, like maybe there's an ideal weight range for them, and being even a little over that reduces their lifespan.
Interesting. And this study had another surprising finding, right? Something about their brains.
Yes. They found that the calorie-restricted lemurs actually lost gray matter in their brains faster as they aged.
Gray matter. That's not good, is it?
Well, not usually, no. But here's the strange part. They didn't see any difference in the lemurs' cognitive abilities or behavior. Like, they seemed just as sharp, even with less gray matter.
So eating less made their brains shrink, but they didn't seem any worse for wear.
Yeah, it's pretty baffling. Scientists aren't totally sure why this happened. Some think it might have to do with changes in how their brains use energy, or maybe the calorie restriction messed with certain growth factors. It's still a bit of a mystery.
A brain-shrinking mystery. Well, that's science for you, always throwing curveballs. Okay, so we've talked about monkeys, lemurs, all these fascinating creatures, but what about us humans? What can we learn from all this primate research? If you're listening to this, thinking about your own health, your own lifespan, what should you take away from all of this?
Okay, so big takeaway number 1. Managing your weight is crucial. If you're carrying around extra weight, the research is pretty clear that dropping those extra pounds can do wonders for your health. You'll lower your risk of all sorts of diseases and potentially even add years to your life.
Makes sense. But what if you're already at a healthy weight?
That's where it gets a bit more nuanced. The studies suggest that if you're already lean and healthy, going super strict with calorie restriction might not give you much extra benefit. And it might even come with some downsides, like we saw with those lemurs and their shrinking brains.
Okay, so calorie restriction isn't a magic bullet for everyone.
Right. And we can't talk about calorie restriction without talking about the quality of your diet.
Yeah.
What you're eating matters just as much as how much you're eating, maybe even more.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme here.
Think about those monkey studies again. The ones eating that highly processed, sugary diet, they saw the biggest improvements from calorie restriction. But the monkeys on the healthier diet, not so much.
So, message received. Focus on eating good stuff, not just eating less stuff.
Exactly. Load up on those whole nutrient-dense foods.
Yeah.
Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, lean protein. You know, the good stuff.
Okay, but what about other approaches like intermittent fasting? Where does that fit in?
Intermittent fasting, or time-restricted eating, is definitely getting a lot of attention these days. And for good reason. It might offer some of the same benefits as calorie restriction, but without having to constantly feel deprived.
So you're not necessarily eating less overall, you're just changing when you eat.
Right. And there's growing evidence that it can do some really great things for your body. Improve your insulin sensitivity, trigger autophagy, which is basically your cells doing a little spring cleaning, and reduce inflammation. All things that are linked to aging.
So you're getting some of the perks of calorie restriction, but in a way that might be easier to stick with.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, don't go overboard. Whether you're restricting calories or doing intermittent fasting, overdoing it can backfire. Remember those lemurs with the shrinking brains?
Oh yeah, I don't want my brain shrinking.
Nobody does.
Yeah.
In humans, too much restriction can lead to other problems, like bone loss, a weakened immune system, losing muscle mass. It's all about balance.
Okay, balance is key. So let's say you're thinking about trying calorie restriction or intermittent fasting. How do you know which one is right for you?
That's a great question. And honestly, the research is still evolving. There's no one definitive answer. Caloric restriction, as we've been talking about, means cutting your daily calories by, let's say, 10 to 30% over the long term. It's shown some promise in animal studies for weight loss, reducing disease risk, maybe even extending lifespan. But it can be really hard to stick to, you know?
Yeah, it sounds pretty restrictive.
It is. And there's the risk of losing muscle mass, slowing down your metabolism, even ending up with nutrient deficiencies if you're not careful.
Okay, so maybe not for everyone. What about intermittent fasting? How does that work exactly?
Intermittent fasting is more about when you eat, not necessarily how much. You basically cycle between periods of eating and fasting on a regular schedule.
So like skipping breakfast or something.
That's one way to do it, yeah. There are different methods, like the 168 method, where you fast for 16 hours and eat within an 8-hour window. Or alternate day fasting, where you eat normally one day and then fast the next. Like we talked about, it can kickstart some beneficial processes in your body, improve your metabolic health. And some people find it a lot easier to manage than constantly counting calories. But it can take some getting used to. You might feel hungry or grumpy at first, have less energy.
So which one is better for longevity and overall health?
Well, for most people, intermittent fasting might be just as effective as moderate calorie restriction for those things. And like you said, probably easier to stick with. If someone's overweight, both approaches can help with weight loss, but intermittent fasting might be a bit better at preserving muscle mass. And if you're already at a healthy weight and active, strict calorie restriction might not be necessary or even a good idea. You could end up losing muscle or feeling tired all the time. But time-restricted eating, without cutting your calories too much, might still be beneficial.
Got it. So whether you choose calorie restriction or intermittent fasting, the real foundation is still a healthy diet.
100%. No matter how much or when you eat, what you eat is still the most important thing.
Back to those whole foods again.
Yep. Lots of high-fiber carbs from vegetables, legumes, whole grains, healthy fats from nuts, seeds, olive oil, avocado, and of course, protein from things like fish, poultry, tofu, beans. All that good stuff helps keep you healthy and strong as you get older.
And just as important, avoiding the not-so-good stuff.
Absolutely. Steer clear of those ultra-processed foods. They're usually loaded with sugar, unhealthy fats, artificial ingredients, the things that just don't do your body any favors.
Processed foods, the enemy of longevity.
Pretty much. Too much sugar especially is a big problem. It messes with your insulin levels, causes inflammation, both of which speed up aging, and even overeating healthy foods can be a problem in the long run. It all adds up.
So what are some simple, practical things our listeners can start doing today to incorporate some of these ideas?
One really easy thing to try is intermittent fasting. Start with a 6 to 8 hour eating window each day. So maybe you eat between noon and 8 p.m. and then fast overnight. And during that eating window, focus on those healthy foods we talked about. Try to avoid snacking late at night. Another tip is to just be mindful of your portion sizes. You don't have to drastically cut back, but maybe try eating a little less than usual, like 10 to 15% less. And always make sure you're getting enough protein. That's super important for maintaining muscle mass as you age.
Great tips. Okay, so to sum it all up for our listeners, the science behind calorie restriction and longevity, especially what we've learned from those primate studies, well, it's complicated. It's not as simple as eat less, live longer. What you eat matters a lot, and for many people, intermittent fasting might be a more manageable and equally effective way to improve their health.
You got it. There's no one right answer for everyone. It depends on your individual health, your lifestyle, your preferences. The key is to be informed and make choices that feel right for you.
And on that note, here's a final thought to ponder. We've seen how important diet quality is, so maybe instead of obsessing over how many calories you're eating, focus more on the types of calories you're consuming. Could that be a more sustainable and ultimately more effective path to a longer, healthier life? Something to think about.